Our speaker tonight is Dr. Melody Green. She is the Dean of Urbana Theological Seminary and our Associate Professor of Christianity and Culture, and she will be speaking about images of redemption in children's stories. So thank you for joining us tonight, Melody.
Thank you, Kay. And I actually wanted to start by reading off a prayer that was actually written by Madeline Lingle. So it's a thank you, Lord, for fairy tale creatures that you have made for our pleasure. And because there is nothing made that you have not made, and nothing thought of that you have not thought of. Thank you for the 7 dwarves who loved Snow White, and for fairies who sleep in the bells of flowers, and for elves who sleep under toadstools and turn their poison to good bread. Help us to keep the creatures of the imagination your creatures and not turn them into our monsters. And remember that sometimes monsters only need to be kissed to be turned into beautiful princes and princesses. Amen. So what I'm talking about tonight, as I said, it's the title is pretty vague. It is a images of redemption in 3 children's stories, and I did not tell people what they were. So I figured, you have to come and find out. Just a moment here. Here we go. That is not the button I meant to give you. So here we go, just a moment. Images of redemption in children's literature. So Dr. Karen Coates is the director of the Graduate Children's Literature Program at Cambridge University in the UK. And she begins her book, Looking Glasses and Neverlands, this way. Stories, it has been said, are as old as bread. I like that image because it links stories to something as indispensable to our survival as food. Just as good bread can often nourish and fortify the soul even more than it does the body, so stories have a profound effect on the growth, the image, and the perceived needs and desires of the body. Indeed, of the whole person. From our very first beginnings, we are fed stories, embraced by stories, nourished by stories. The only way we come to make sense of the world is through the stories we are told. They pattern the world we have fallen into, effectively replacing its terrors and inconsistencies with structured images that assure us of its manageability. Thus, stories do more than just provide us with entertainment. The pictures and patterns of the stories we were given as children helped us shape our understanding of ourselves as well as the world we live in. Therefore, stories with images of redemption are stories that help us shape our own understanding of that concept. This role that story plays in our understanding of our world also includes our understanding of God, how he relates to us, and how we are to relate to him. The Bible is filled with stories, and in the Gospels, 1/3 of everything Jesus said is told in story form. But so often, when we attempt to communicate the doctrines of Christianity, we move away from story and into a place that is dry and boring. And instead of helping children and others understand these doctrines, we're pushed away by the dryness of theological discussion, the bewildering language used in church services, and the underlying churchy assumption that there are certain ways we should feel about things we do not yet understand. C.S. Lewis's addresses what stories can do regarding this issue in an essay called Sometimes Fairy Stories Say Best What Is to Be Said. Why did one find it so hard to feel as one was told one ought to feel about God or about the sufferings of Christ? I thought the chief reason was that one was told one ought to. An obligation to feel can freeze feelings, and reverence itself did harm. The whole subject was associated with lowered voices, almost as if it was something medical. But supposing that by casting all these things into an imaginary world, stripping them of their stained glass and Sunday school associations, one could make them for their first time appear in their real potency. Could one not thus steal past those watchful dragons? I thought one could. This was, according to C.S. Lewis, what led him to write The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which I'm guessing you probably, if you'd thought about which stories I was going to address, you probably guessed that one. In this book, concepts central to historical Christian theology are presented in a story so that the reader can experience what all of the dry, dusty language of theology is really about and respond accordingly. The central theological concept that Lewis works through in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is redemption. According to E.F. Harrison in the Evangelical Dictionary of Theology, redemption is the means by which salvation is achieved. In Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis explains that not just redemption in general, but a specific understanding of what the word redemption means is the central focus of Christianity itself. We must believe that redemption was bought when Jesus died and rose again, and somehow this has made us right with God. As Lewis points out in multiple places, this is a difficult concept for children to understand, and that difficulty is not made any easier by the environments in which children too often encounter this concept. But The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is not the only story to present such images to children. We will come back to it, but I want to start somewhere else. Those of you who are familiar with the personal story of C.S. Lewis will know that one of the most important moments in the story of his conversion was a conversation that he had with J.R.R. Tolkien at a place in Oxford called Addison's Walk. Lewis argued that Christianity was just like every other ancient mythology. Every mythological system has a dying god. Egyptian has Osiris, Norse myth has Balder. The story of Jesus, Lewis argued, is just another dying god story. Tolkien responded that while yes, all of these other mythological systems have dying gods, it does not make Christianity untrue. In fact, it's quite the opposite. Tolkien argued that all of these ancient stories were pointers, guiding us to the true dying God who was a real person who lived in a real time at a real place. While this argument was an important point in Lewis's conversion, the idea did not originate with Tolkien. He got the idea from G.K. Chesterton's The Everlasting Man, who in turn got the idea from an early church father, St. Jerome, who in turn got his idea, he said, from such passages as Romans 1:19-20 or Acts 14:6-17. So let's look at those a little closer to see what Jerome saw in them. Just a second here. So Romans 1:19-20. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world and the things that have been made, so that they are without excuse. Now, Jerome and Chesterton and Tolkien and everyone else in that train of thought argues that when he says the things that have been made, not just talking about God's creation, but the things that humans made as creators creating in the image of God, that they naturally reflect who God is. The other one, Acts 14:16-17, says, in the past, he, that being God, let all nations go their own way. Yet he has not left himself without testimony. He has shown kindness by giving you rain from heaven and crops in their seasons. He provides you with plenty of food and fills your hearts with joy. And one of those things that St. Jerome and others would argue that fill their hearts with joy is story. These are all things that reflect who God is. Now, if you're really interested in this topic, there's a more current exploration of this in a book called Eternity in Their Hearts by a guy named Don Richardson. Here, there's a copy of it. Whoa, hey, maybe not. Okay, well, I was going to show you my copy of it, but my green screen is not letting me. That's really funny.
Green screen's not liking it.
It's not liking it. It's called Eternity in Their Hearts. It's by a guy named Don Richardson, and he's looking at different stories from missionaries, from different cultures, different groups of people who encountered things in these cultures that they were not expecting that directly relate to Christian thought, Christian teaching, even though it's in places they were not expecting it at all. So anyway, the idea works like this. Throughout history and across cultures, God has put things in the stories that people tell each other that point directly to himself. The authors of the stories may not be aware themselves that this is what's happening. In some cases, they may simply even be writing out their own longing for what they wish would happen or was real without knowing that that longing is fulfilled in Christ. So the first story I'm going to use as an example of redemption in children's literature may well actually fit that category. Kenneth Graham's The Wind in the Willows. If we were all together in the same room, I'd say, hey, raise your hand if you've read The Wind in the Willows, but you'll just have to, raise your hand on your own. Kenneth Graham's The Wind in the Willows uses the image of a lost child being found to present a story about redemption that focuses on the glory and awe-inspiring nature of the one who brings about that redemption. There's a chapter called The Piper at the Gates of Dawn. And in that chapter, an otter child has gone missing. All the characters are animals, and they even have names like rat, mole, badger. If you haven't read it, or if it's been a long time since you've read it. So this otter child disappears. Mole and rat decide that they are going to go search for him. And rat explains why. You see, well, there are, after all, traps and things, you know. So the distraught father waits in one place, Mr. Otter, just in case the child comes back there. Rat and mole take a boat and go to search for the child by moonlight. They spend all night searching. They find nothing. Just as dawn begins to approach and they're exhausted and they're discouraged, Rat hears a sound unlike any he has heard before. He declares, "Oh, mole, the beauty of it, the merry bubble and joy, the thin, clear, happy call of distant piping. Such music I never dreamed of, and the call in it is stronger even than the music is sweet. Row on, mole, row, for the music and the call must be for us." Rat is described as being transported, trembling, possessed in all his senses by this new divine thing that caught up his helpless soul. Both animals forget their search for the lost child in their rapturous response to this otherworldly music that compels them. They must come. They arrive at a small island where Rat declares, "Here, in this holy place, here, if anywhere, we shall find him." The word him is capitalized. It is not the missing child, but someone else Rat is referring to. And Mole understands. When they find that someone else, Mole has his own religious experience. Then suddenly the mole felt a great awe fall upon him, an awe that turned his muscles to water, bowed his head, and rooted his feet to the ground. It was no panic terror. Indeed, he felt wonderfully at peace and happy. But it was an awe that smote and held him, and without seeing, he knew it could only mean that some august presence was very, very near. Mole looks up, finding himself looking directly into the eyes of the one who called them. This character is described as having horns on his head, cloven feet, and plays a pipe. He is, in essence, the god Pan. Not the direction you thought this was going, was it? He is, in essence, the Greek god Pan. In Greek mythology, Pan is the god of nature and of the wild. And on the one hand, it may make sense that the Greek god Pan would be the one to rescue the child because an otter is an animal. He lives in the wild. Pan is the god of the wild in Greek myth. But the myths in which Pan appears do not show him to be particularly careful of creatures. In fact, his most common pursuit is chasing after women. This Pan, however, is described with language that the Bible reserves for the Holy Spirit. He is the friend and helper. Now, it is the Christian God who tells us that he looks after sparrows and knows when even one of them falls. It is Jesus who rescues the lost lamb, or otter. But at the same time, that language, he is the friend and helper, it sets Pan up as a Christ figure. Plutarch, and I'll say that this is uniquely appropriate. Plutarch, he was an old Greek guy a long time ago. He points out, Roman guy a long time ago, in a text called The Obsolescence of Oracles, that Pan is the only one of the Greek or Roman gods who actually dies. Thus, it directly connects him to the dying god stories that C.S. Lewis and Tolkien discussed as pointers to Christ. But the death of Pan makes him a particular Christ figure because of the timing that Plutarch places on that particular event. Pan's death occurs, according to Plutarch, during the time that Tiberius ruled the Roman Empire. When was that? Well, the early church father Eusebius, you may know if you've taken church history, or New Testament overview here at the seminary, you know what time that is. But the early church father Eusebius of Caesarea points out in his book, The Preparation for the Gospel, that this was the same time, the time that Plutarch said that Pan died, it was the same time that Jesus was here on earth. And Eusebius sees this as proof that Jesus overthrew all demons and evil spirits that were worshipped as gods. Later authors, from John Milton to G.K. Chesterton, picked up on this theme, discussing the death of Pan as the harbinger of the coming of Christ. So it's not unfitting, in fact, maybe in some ways fulfilling all of this, that Pan becomes a Christ figure himself in The Wind and the Willows. Back to the story. When Mole looks into the eyes of this god, Pan, he smiles. That is, Pan smiles, not Mole. Mole quickly looks down and sees that the young otter is lying safe between Pan's feet. Mole breaks the silence. "Rat," he found breath to whisper, shaking. "Are you afraid?" "Afraid," murmured the rat, his eyes shining with unutterable love. "Afraid of him? Oh, never, never. And yet, oh, Mole, I am afraid." Then the two animals, crouching to the earth, bowed their heads and did worship. Both Mole and Rat immediately recognize the person before them and respond with a combination of love, awe, respect, and fear. They've encountered a being to whom the only proper response is reverence. The child has been saved by Pan from traps and things. But at the moment, he is secondary to the glory of the one who saves or redeems the lost. Even though it is the child's salvation from traps and things that is at stake, the child has actually slept through this entire thing. The only part of his adventure, his redemption, that he understands is that moment when Rat and Mole bring him back to his father and their relationship is restored. The next story we're going to look at is one that I'm assuming most of you are not as familiar with. It's East of the Sun and West of the Moon. It's a Norwegian fairy tale. It's been translated into many languages, retold many times. The pictures I have here on the screen are two different, relatively recent retellings of this book in English, published here in the United States. Even though such stories change over time and have many tellers, fairy tales themselves are full of potentially Christian imagery. And again, there's a lot of people who talk about this. One example would be G.K. Chesterton, who explains in The Ethics of Elfland, an essay that's a chapter of the book Orthodoxy. He explains how when he was growing up, he grew up in an atheist household, never had a Bible, but was given fairy tales. And he learned the most basic tenets of faith through reading fairy tales. He argues that that was an important part of his conversion to Christianity. In the essay on fairy stories, Tolkien argues that fairy tales follow the pattern of the gospel. It's the same storyline. And in his book, God of the Fairy Tale, Jim Ware argues that these stories teach us the same realities that the Bible teaches. Jim Ware points out that fairy tales take sin and evil seriously, but that grace, forgiveness, and second chances do exist. Unfortunately, there's always, according to Ware, a price to be paid for the happy ending in the fairy tale. And this, Ware argues, should remind us all of the sufferings of Christ, who bought our salvation with his life. Bearing these things in mind, let's take a closer look at how, in the Norwegian fairy tale East of the Sun and West of the Moon, not one, but two pictures of redemption can be found. So, because I'm assuming most of you are not as familiar with this one, I'm going to go ahead and summarize it for you. So the gist of the story is this. There's a poor farmer and his family, and they are slowly starving to death. One day, a white bear knocks on the door and promises that he will make the entire family rich on one condition. The farmer just needs to give him the youngest daughter of the family. Well, they're all starving. So an agreement's made with her permission, and the bear takes her. This is the first act of redemption in the story. The young woman's agreement to give up the life she has already known buys not only the lives of everyone else in her family, but their wealth and happiness as well. Just as one person, Christ, gave up his life for many, this girl, who's not named in the original retellings of the story, gives up her life for her family. Now, this is especially notable that in some retellings, it kind of depends on the audience and when and so forth, the narrator of the story likes to emphasize that polar bears usually eat people. She doesn't have a whole lot of hope when she makes that exchange. But that's not what happens. This bear takes her to a magical palace where not only all of her needs are met, but she can have absolutely anything she wants. There's just one issue, stipulation, whatever you want to call it. The polar bear, during the day, the polar bear is her only company. Every night, after it goes dark, the bear turns into a man, and in the darkness, they share a bed. Over time, the bear realizes, though, that no matter what he does during the day to make her happy, she is very sad. So he offers to let her go home and visit her family again on one condition. Notice the conditions here. If her mother asks to speak to her alone, she must say no. So the daughter goes back home, has a lovely visit with her family. They all express admiration of her new clothes and all the stories she tells about her wonderful new home. But before she goes home, her mom gets that chance to talk to her alone and insists that her daughter must really be living with an evil troll, because no decent human could possibly be doing these things. So she gives her daughter a candle, advises her to look at the man while he's asleep, but she must not drop any candle wax on him. Now, if you're familiar with your Greek mythology, this sounds at this point very much like the story of Cupid and Psyche. It's originally told in Apuleius's book, The Golden Ass. If you know that story, you know what happens next as well. Exact same place that this one goes. She does exactly what her mother tells her to do. She lights the candle, she looks at him, and she realizes that the man she's been with is not only human, but, oh my goodness, the most beautiful man she's ever seen, and he's probably even a prince. So she's surprised, and she accidentally drops candle wax on him. Hot candle wax wakes him up. And there's the tragedy. He is not a troll, but he has been cursed by a troll to be a bear by day, and he is only himself at night. To break the spell, he has to get a woman to love him for 1 year without her ever seeing who he really is. But if that attempt fails, then he has to marry a horrible troll princess. So now that all's been lost, he will be taken to the castle east of the sun and west of the moon to await his fate. So the prince and his magical castle disappear, and the farmer's daughter is left alone in the cold and the snow. Now, she could have returned home to her family and told them what happened, but instead, she undergoes this long, painful journey that's apparently hopeless to find the castle east of the sun and west of the moon. And she gets all kinds of help from all sorts of different supernatural creatures, including the anthropomorphic personifications of the four winds. Say that 5 times fast. She finds the castle that the prince is imprisoned in, but now she has to still rescue him. So she finds the castle, she finds the prince. It's still not happily ever after. She has to rescue him from the troll woman. So the troll, I don't remember when that picture was supposed to come in. That was part of the story. I must have skipped that slide, or the note that told me to show you. But the troll woman gives her various tasks, and she suffers both mentally and physically in order to try to purchase him from her. And she comes up with different deals. The trolls in the stories, in a lot of Norwegian stories, love making deals with people, and they usually win. So this troll keeps making different deals, but it's not much of a stretch to say, as Jim Ware says of all fairy tales, that the sufferings of the farmer's daughter remind us of the sufferings of Christ for our redemption. She is trying to buy the prince off of the troll by her suffering. Finally, an agreement is made between the prince, the troll queen, and the farm girl that the prince will only marry the person who can wash the candle wax out of the shirt. He still has the shirt that is stained with that candle wax. So the troll princess tries. She's a princess. She's never washed anything in her life. The shirt just gets worse until it's finally completely, totally black with dirt. But the farm girl, who has suffered so much just to be there, when she washes it, the shirt comes out white as snow. Okay, I just had to show you this one because it's like the happy ever after picture. So the prince and now the princess get married, live happily ever after. He is no longer under the curse. The curse has been broken. He gets to be the prince in the castle again. As you can see, this farm girl actually gives us two pictures of the redemption of Christ. In the first, she is literally the price that was paid. In the second, she is the one who does the paying, first by suffering as she searches for the prince, then by suffering in the troll castle, and then finally when she washes that shirt. It's interesting that the shirt is actually what's reflecting where the relationship went wrong in the first place, but also the Bible offers us many images that connect washing with redemption. From the purification rituals that are set out in the books of the law in the Old Testament to Psalms 51:7 that says, it declares to God, wash me and I will be whiter than snow. It's a psalm of repentance, asking God to wash us, to be white, just like the prince's shirt. These images are used again when Jesus says that we must be born of water and the Spirit. Now, both of these first two children's stories we have discussed focus on specific aspects of redemption. The first focuses on the power and majesty of the one who does the redeeming. The second focuses more on the suffering and risk involved in the exchange. You knew this one was coming, right? What is quite possibly both the richest and most complex image of redemption available in literature for children can be found in C.S. Lewis's The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Both of the stories of redemption that we've looked at so far start with a basic need. In both of those stories, that is pure survival. In The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, however, the need is more complex. So in Narnia, always winter, never Christmas. They're under the rule of the White Witch. The child Edmund has agreed to betray his brother and two sisters to the White Witch, who's planning to kill them. And then later, the witch explains that even though she can't get her hands on all four children, she can certainly get her claws into one of them, because every traitor belongs to me as my lawful prey, and for every treachery, I have a right to a kill. She particularly desires this death because a prophecy stated that when four children sit on the four thrones in the nearby castle of Cair Paravel, her reign would end. When creatures on Aslan's side make it clear that they have no intention of giving Edmund up, she responds, "Unless I have blood, as the law says, all Narnia will be overturned and perish in fire and water." Aslan admits that this is indeed the case. So in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the need for redemption is multifaceted. Edmund, like the lost otter child in The Wind and the Willows, needs to have his very life saved. The Narnians need to be saved from the rule of the White Witch, but one of the children they had their hopes in has actually just made things a whole lot worse. And to make matters even worse, if the White Witch doesn't kill Edmund, they will all die. Redemption is definitely needed in Narnia. Just as Rat and Mole are awed by their experience with Pan, the children in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe have a similar experience regarding the Redeemer of Narnia, the lion Aslan. They first hear his name when Mr. Beaver tries to explain why they should trust him. When he says that Aslan is on the move, the name itself either attracts or repels them. At the name of Aslan, each of the children felt something jump in its inside. Edmund felt a sense of mysterious horror. Peter felt suddenly brave and adventurous. Susan felt as if some delicious smell or some delightful strain of music had just floated by her. And Lucy got the feeling you have when you wake up in the morning and realize it is the beginning of the holidays or the beginning of summer. Later, when Mr. and Mrs. Beaver discuss a plan of action with the children after dinner, Aslan's name comes up again. Again, the children have that same feeling, like the first signs of spring, like good news had come over them. Mr. Beaver explains that Aslan is the king, and he is the one who will make everything right again. When the children realize that it is a lion, not a human, they are going to be meeting, Susan admits that she is nervous. Mrs. Beaver responds, "If there's anyone who can appear before Aslan without their knees knocking, they're either braver than most or just silly." Lucy asks, "Then he isn't safe?" To which Mr. Beaver responds, "Safe? Who said anything about safe? Of course he isn't safe. But he's good. He's the king, I tell you. I'm longing to see him, said Peter, even if I do feel frightened when it comes to the point. When the children finally meet Aslan, the narrator explains their experience. People who have not been in Narnia sometimes think that a thing cannot be good and terrible at the same time. If the children had ever thought so, they were cured of it now. For when they tried to look at Aslan's face, they just caught a glimpse of the golden mane and the great royal, solemn, overwhelming eyes. And then they found they could not look at him and went all trembling. There are some distinct similarities between this passage and the piper at the gates of dawn in The Wind in the Willows. Like Rat and Mole, their first experience of the Christ figure who will save the lost is one of awe mixed with love and delight. He is so powerful that Rat and Mole, as well as the children, are already affected by him before even seeing him. The pull of the music and the sheer wonder of the name draw them in, or, in the case of already committed elsewhere Edmund, pushes him away. The children, as well as the animals, find that their first actual encounter with the mysterious other is completely outside their experience. While the girl in East of the Sun, West of the Moon suffers to rescue the prince, in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, redemption is bought at a much steeper price. When the White Witch approaches Aslan to demand her sacrifice, he makes a deal with her. One so unthinkable that none of his followers can guess what it is. Aslan trades places with Edmund, thus saving both the child and the land of Narnia in one costly move. The witch, of course, believes she has won everything, as she says to Aslan immediately before stabbing him, "Understand that you have given me Narnia forever. You have lost your life and did not save his. In that knowledge, despair and die." Throughout the history of Christianity, there have been a variety of models presented to explain exactly how the death of Christ restores our relationship with God. And several of these can be seen at work in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. One of these is the penal substitution model, particularly favored by John Calvin. In this model, death is the punishment for sin. In dying, Jesus took our punishment and set us free. In Narnia, the punishment for betrayal is death. Aslan takes this punishment and sets Edmund free. Clearly, this model for understanding redemption is at work in this text, but it is not the only one. In fact, I'm going to say that I've read many different models of atonement that have been presented throughout the history of the church the last 2,000 years. And each one of them, I have seen people argue that it's in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. But unfortunately, we don't have time to go over all of them. So we're just hitting 3 of them. So the second one we're hitting is a much older model favored by Origen and other early church writers. And it's called, whoops, wrong button, the Ransom Theory. Give me just a second here. I just totally hit the wrong button on the wrong computer. Talk amongst yourselves. Okay. This is what happens when you have working with 2 computers at once. Yeah. Okay, here we go. Much older model favored by Origen and other early church writers, the Ransom Theory. There we go. So in the Ransom Theory model of atonement, Adam and Eve's sin sold humanity to the devil. God had to buy us back. He owed something to the devil. And what he used to buy us back was Jesus's blood. It's the debt that was paid. Now, some people have seen this model at work in the moment when the White Witch stakes her claim on Edmund's life, and Aslan offers her something even more to her liking. Aslan's death, like Jesus's death, is what pays the ransom. Now, around the year 600, Pope Gregory the Great took this model to a further extreme, and he declared that Jesus actually deceived Satan in offering himself to be killed in our place. In this model, Satan takes the bait because he believes that killing Jesus is going to kill Christ off for good across all time and eternity. In reality, however, it seals Satan's own fate, and he begins to lose his hold of his kingdom at the moment when Jesus rises again. Even this model can be seen in Narnia. Before the White Witch declares that she has the right to kill Edmund, She reminds Aslan that this exchange, blood for treason, was declared law by the emperor beyond the sea at the very beginning of Narnia. And she gives it a name, the deep magic. And it has to be said that way, the deep magic. As soon as their private conversation is ended, the look on her face shows that the White Witch believes she has already won. Her words in the moments before she stabs Aslan give her away. But when Aslan comes back to life, he explains to Susan and Lucy that there is another magic that the witch does not know, the deeper magic from before the dawn of time. When a willing victim who had committed no treachery was killed in a traitor's stead, the table would crack and death itself would start working backwards. Yes, that is the deeper magic from before the dawn of time. The table is no longer a place to kill victims. Its magical power is broken, and Aslan frees everyone the witch had turned to stone, and everyone who is currently in battle with the witch. And when he leads them into battle, the White Witch and her army is defeated. So Aslan's sacrificial death was written in such a way that it reflects multiple models for redemption. It has been removed from its stained glass window setting and placed in an environment where it can be experienced in all of its richness and complexity. Another result of Aslan's resurrection is that a variety of the characters have the chance to get to know sides of him that they didn't see before. Some even get to see that he has a playful side. Within minutes of his resurrection, Aslan plays tag with Susan and Lucy. In the Castle of the White Witch, he quotes a nursery rhyme while giving the instructions to carefully look everywhere. Remember that line, upstairs and downstairs and in my lady's chamber? It comes from an English children's rhyme called Goosey Goosey Gander. Yes, Aslan was quoting Goosey Goosey Gander. He completely delights another lion simply by using the words, us lions. Remember that? One of my favorite scenes in the whole book. Us lions. He said, us lions. That means him and me, us lions. Ultimately, then, as Lewis believed could be done, stories can present truths in ways that help us understand and respond not only to the world we live in, but specifically to theology and such things in theology as the image or images of redemption. They can teach us theology without our even being aware that this is what is happening as we're reading the stories. In this way, stories have the ability to enrich our understanding both of God and of ourselves. And that is it. Thank you very much. Okay, I believe you have the questions that have been asked. It looks like there might be a few.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Melody, for sharing that with us.
Thank you for listening.
I'm just trying to get this adjusted so people see us both again. Here we go. So we don't have any questions yet, but while people get a second to type them in, we do have a lot of comments. So I'm going to read some of them to you and you can comment on them. When you're talking about the first story, we had some comments that people love Peace Child by Don Richardson, love Wind in the Willows, Eternity in Their Hearts by Don Richardson, and one person said they love East of the Moon, Sun and West of the Moon since 4th grade.
Cool.
We also had somebody, oh, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say, that's awesome. Go ahead, keep going.
We also had somebody mention that the troll images remind me of Morris Sendak Where the Wild Things Are. Is that something, has that been a book that you've ever done any work with?
Yes.
In your work with children's literature?
I have actually. That's a really interesting question. There's so much that you can do with Where the Wild Things Are. It's a very simple story, but it does so many things. I've used it, just a few different ways I've used it. When I've taught children's lit classes where we look at illustration, you can look at how the pictures themselves, if you look at the pages, the first page has no picture. And then the next page has a picture and you've got the white page and then a picture that's kind of centered. Each page, as you go into the story deeper and deeper, the picture gets bigger, the white space gets smaller, till there is no white space at all and no text. And then it goes back out that way. So you can talk about what Maurice Sendak is doing with symbolism in terms of how he uses space and picture. But even more to the point, there's a lot of ways people read Where the Wild Things Are. And I think one of the most important ways of looking at it is it's a retelling of the story of the prodigal son. you've got a kid who has, his parent says, here's kind of the rules. And he says, forget you. He actually says, I'll eat you up. He's sent to his room. He runs away. He has these new friends that he makes and has a lot of fun with them. Bum, 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 bum. He has this wild rumpus. Sorry, that was a wild rumpus, guys. But then he realizes that, this new life of his isn't really all it's cracked up to be. And there is nobody here who loves him. They're just all, having a wild rumpus together, and that's not really love. So he goes back home, and when he gets back home in his bedroom, his dinner is waiting for him, and it's still hot. So the story can be looked at as a retelling of the prodigal son. Now, did Maurice Sendak intend to do that? Well, he is not a Christian author, but I think in the same way that a story like The Wind in the Willows reflects redemption, I think that Where the Wild Things Are is doing very much the same thing. But good question.
That is absolutely fascinating. I had no idea there was so much going on. I'm never going to look at that book the same way now. We do have a couple more questions and comments, so I'll come back to the comments once we run out of steam with the questions. But the first question was, were the first two authors Christian?
No. Graham Greene most emphatically was not, in fact. He was a British guy. He actually fought in World War I, the same war that Tolkien and Lewis fought in. But he was just, no. So again, that's why I was talking about at the beginning, that there's a lot of people who talk about how stories can reflect the truth of God without the authors themselves even knowing it. And that it can reflect, like I think in the case of Graham Greene, he gets so much right about holiness and about who God is and what redemption is because he wants it to be true. There's another children's author who actually outright said that that's why he wrote the stories the way he did, and that's Lloyd Alexander. He wrote a series called The Prydain Chronicles. Disney loosely based a movie, The Black Cauldron, on the Prydain Chronicles, very loosely. But Lloyd Alexander said that he loved Christianity, and he deliberately was even playing with some Christian imagery because he wished it was true, but he couldn't bring himself to believe it. But that doesn't stop those images from being there in his books and doing exactly what they should be doing, if that makes any sense.
How fascinating. So do you say that people who are Christians and interpreting the stories in a Christian way can still find meaning and learn from them? I mean, I'm guessing you would answer yes to that because you're giving
Yes.
this presentation.
Well, there's also a concept. Chris Mitchell, he used to be the director of the Marion Wade Center at Wheaton College, where they have Lewis's manuscripts. He talked about something he called Proto-Evangelism. It's those patterns in stories that set people up to be ready for the story of Christ when you meet it. And that's what the book Eternity in Their Hearts is all about. It's what Tolkien was arguing to Lewis, that all of these stories about dying gods were really about. They're pointing you so that when you meet the story of Christ, it makes sense. You can go, oh, that's how this works. So yeah.
Wonderful. Another question is, can you address how Tolkien and the concept that evil inevitably ends up destroying itself, similar to Screwtape and Wormwood, and how Voldemort unknowingly sets up his demise?
Would you repeat the question? I think it feels to me like the question answered itself, so I'm not sure. Go ahead and repeat it.
Can you address Tolkien and the concept that evil inevitably ends up destroying itself? And then they take as an example Screwtape and Wormwood from one of C.S. Lewis's books, and then Voldemort from Harry Potter.
Well, okay. That's a really interestingly worded question, because that is a pretty solid, I mean, when you look at St. Augustine, for example, when he talks about sin, all sin is, it's nothing new. It's something good that has been corrupted. And the whole idea of what even is evil, when you look at it through that lens, that it is good things that have just been messed up, used in the wrong way, abused, then of course, bringing everything back to the way God meant it to be is undoing evil. It's not completely wiping out everything. It's bringing the good out of that evil, bringing it back to what it was supposed to have been in the first place. Addressing Tolkien with that. Well, when you read, see, I am not sure that Tolkien is the best person to use as an example of evil always undoing itself. Because other people certainly had to work very hard. And the same thing with Voldemort. Other people had to work very, very hard and sacrifice an awful lot for evil to be undone in those stories.
Interesting. The person who asked the question said they were just curious to hear your thoughts about it.
Okay.
So
Okay.
I think you're doing a great job addressing that. What about, I'm curious to ask your opinion then, what about the White Witch? I mean, there was certainly sacrifice, but she also inadvertently stepped into this system and made the mistake that ended up being fatal to her. Would you say that evil had its own roots of its undoing in that case, or not really?
Let me think about that for a minute. The White Witch is a really interesting case because she, she first comes into Narnia in The Magician's Nephew, where she accidentally ends up in Narnia with a group of children, and her name is Jadis. She's from another world. She steals a apple that is supposed to help you live forever. Boy, does that sound like the Garden of Eden. And that action, we're told in that book, is actually what's going to bring her sorrow and death in the future. So in that situation, yes, definitely. When she buys into this whole exchange that Aslan does and says, okay, great idea. It's the acting out of what was set in motion long, long ago in the history of Narnia.
That makes sense. It's always interesting to hear your thoughts about these. We had one more question. They kind of answered their own question, but I'm still curious to ask it and hear your thoughts about it. And someone said the Norwegian fairy tale reminded me of Beauty and the Beast. Did Tolkien say why fairy tales were heralds of the gospel? And then the follow-up statement was, oh, that Dr. Green is saying fairy tales indicate the gospel because their authors, whether Christian or not, have eternity in their hearts.
Okay. Let's break that down into three things, because all three of those are really interesting statements. The first one, that it reminded the person of Beauty and the Beast. Yes. So in folklore studies, there were two Scandinavian scholars, Arne and Thompson, who put together this whole system looking at fairy tales. And they argued that the stories that people tell literally around the world all fall into certain categories, and they're all closely related to each other. And they put Beauty and the Beast, Cupid and Psyche, East of the Sun, West of the Moon, a Scottish fairy tale called The Black Bull of Norroway, not to be confused with Norway. All of those, they would say, are the same story, that they have all of these elements that make it, here's what it is doing for people when they hear this story. So yeah, yes, very much, very similar to Beauty and the Beast. Good observation. So what was the second part of that?
Did Tolkien say why fairy tales were heralds of the gospel?
Yes. I'm wondering if I have a copy. I don't think I do. Yeah, no. I do not have a copy of it at home, but in the epilogue of On Fairy Stories, the entire epilogue is about how that works. But part of it is that fairy tales, quite literally, when you look at the plot, or actually I will say the plot of a good fairy tale, because if you sit down and read all of the Grimm's fairy tales, not all of them are going to follow this plot. I can think of one that the name translates The Boy Who Would Not Shake and Shiver, that does not follow this plot. But you notice that's not one of the ones Disney chose to make a movie about. There's a reason why. But all of the good fairy tales, you've got a fall, you've got a need for some sort of redemption. That redemption is bought somehow. And then there's the happy ending. He even calls it the consolation of the happy ending. But he also talks about something called the eucatastrophe. That is the good catastrophe. It's that moment in the story when nothing can possibly get any worse. Aslan's dead. Harry Potter's dead. Oh, sorry, if that ruined the story for anybody.
Spoilers.
Spoiler, sorry. Gandalf's dead. Okay, Frodo says, sorry, I just keep thinking those ones. Frodo says, I have come, but I do not choose to do that which I have come to do. You're at this crisis moment. Nothing can possibly get any worse. There is no sign of hope. And then something happens that turns everything around. And it's this gasp of, Tolkien calls it the eucatastrophe, the good catastrophe, the thing no one was expecting. Aslan comes back to life again. Harry Potter, oh wait, I can't ruin the story for you. You get the idea. So that Tolkien says that the death and resurrection of Christ is the eucatastrophe of human history. So that, things couldn't possibly get any worse. Jesus, who we thought was God, is dead and there's no hope. And then, wait, what? He comes back to life again? How? That changes everything. So that's a part of what he's explaining in that epilogue. But I would highly recommend, if you want to know more about it, get your hands on Fairy Stories by J.R.R. Tolkien. I believe there are free copies of it online that you can get your hands on. It's also in the book, The Tolkien Reader. So yeah. What was the third question or third part of that?
Wonderful. This statement was just clarifying that you're saying fairy tales to indicate the gospel because authors, whether they're Christian or not, have eternity in their hearts. Is that a true statement?
That is what, Don Richardson would argue, that his whole idea of eternity in their hearts is the same thing that Tolkien was talking about with the idea of the dying gods, that all of these dying god stories point us to Christ. That different ways, the truth of who God is comes out in stories in different ways. That doesn't mean that every story is always going to point us to God. I would be very interested to see if someone could convince me that the Game of Thrones is a story that points us to God. But there are many stories that do, without necessarily, sometimes with the authors deliberately intending to, like the Chronicles of Narnia. Sometimes the people who told those stories didn't intend to. And then you get the second story, East of the Sun and West of the Moon, is particularly interesting because it's a folk tale that was handed on from person to person and got retold and retold. So there isn't one author, but every time it gets retold and published as the story, it's got those same basic elements in it that do point us to the gospel.
That gives me a perfect transition into the next question, which was that there was a well-known book that classified all stories of the world into 7 categories. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but if you are familiar with it, do you believe that that's true, that there are only 7 main categories of types of stories in the world?
So interestingly enough, if you give me a minute, I could go grab that book. Categorizing is interesting because there's so many different ways you can do it. Arne Thompson had many, many, many more than 7. There was a guy named Vladimir Propp. He was a Russian scholar, I believe in the 1920s, who argued that all story is, instead of saying there's categories or like only 7 basic stories, he argued that every story, there's an alphabet of story, that there's like 20, I think he had maybe 32 elements, that every story that exists is made up of a combination of those elements. Just like any word we say is made up of a combination of letters in our alphabet. So I find, to say, is it true or not? That's an interesting question. I find categorization very interesting because sometimes it tells you more about the person who's creating the categories than it does about the thing that is being categorized. So on the one hand, I could say, sure, I would have, 7 stories. On the other hand, sorry, I paused for a moment going, maybe I should go grab it and show it to you. It's a really big fat book. But then I realized, oh yeah, if I can't show you eternity in their hearts, I probably can't show you that one either. So yes, a lot of things like that, categorizing makes sense out of things, but I don't know that I would say it's an absolute truth, if that makes sense. It's a way of gaining control or understanding of something you're working with.
There's a famous quote among the science and mathematics and statistics community that says, I'm blanking on the speaker at the moment, but he says, all models are wrong, some models are useful, kind of along those lines.
I like that. I like that a lot. That's interesting you say that, because I used to know a person who was a algebra professor long ago in a galaxy far, far away. And he used to say that when you get into higher level thinking, there's no difference between literature studies and algebra and math. And I'm like, okay. At the time, I did not understand what he was saying, but when we come across things like that, it's like, yeah, actually, there are a lot of similarities in thought there.
Sounds
So
like an interesting person to sit down and have coffee with. Actually, I would love for you and that person to have coffee and just let me sit and listen.
that would be a lot of fun.
I'm sorry, I interrupted. You were going to say
okay.
if there are only 7.
So I don't remember what I was going to say. I
I'm
apologize.
so sorry.
No, that's quite all
my
right.
fault.
It probably wasn't any good anyway.
We have another question here. So if the good news comes out in many ways, then I guess that all good stories have some bits of it. What do you think about that?
Ooh. Let me think about that for a minute. If the
Still
good
thinking
news,
about your Game of Thrones analogy, although I'm wondering if there's any good, if Game of Thrones counts as a good story.
see, I think that it might depend on what you mean by good story. I think Tolkien would argue that, yes, all good stories have the gospel, but I think that's kind of a circular argument, because I think he would look at a story and say, oh, it doesn't. Well, it's not a good story. Ooh, that is an interesting question. It might depend on why you're calling a story good. If you're calling a story good because it's a story that keeps getting retold for some reason and people really love it, that may be something that needs to be explored more. That could be a really interesting explanation of why people love story, or that particular story. If you're calling it good because it's a story that grabs your attention personally, that may or may not be because of the gospel in it. I know an awful lot of people who love the Game of Thrones, and I'm pretty sure it's not because of any gospel that's in it, but it grabs them in some way. And sometimes stories grab us and we think they're good more because of things that happen to ourselves in our own lives than because of bigger picture things. I'm just thinking here. I mean, the example I'm giving, I just thought of, it's a very silly one, but I have a deep, deep, undying love for Scooby-Doo. When I was a child, you see, I was one of 5 children. And if you pay attention, there are 5 main characters in Scooby-Doo. And when I was little and I was watching Scooby-Doo, I kind of felt this connection to the Scooby Gang, or the mystery, whatever they called themselves. Yeah, that's not because the gospel's there. That's because of something very different. I will still argue that those are good stories. In fact, I just watched a couple of them not long ago. I was very sick. Well, not sick, having reactions to my COVID shot. And I actually ended up watching a couple of episodes of Scooby-Doo because I was that out of it. I will argue they are excellent stories to watch when you're not feeling well. Is that because they reflect the gospel? Well, now that I've said that, they expose sin. Ooh, every one of those stories starts when something bad happens that could be representative or could possibly represent the fall. Sin is exposed. Article coming out. I don't know, one of those two.
I blipped my internet connection for a minute there, but I think you were still there. I think it was mine that was frozen, hopefully. So okay, it was just me. So I'm wondering about Sherlock Holmes now. Can I interject and ask you to do Sherlock Holmes?
Ooh. So when I think of Sherlock Holmes, there have been so many different retellings of it. There's the Arthur Conan Doyle, of course, original stories. Weirdly enough, there's a video lecture that I made my students watch on mysteries that we're going to talk about tomorrow night in our Christianity and Children's Lit class, where I talk about that a little bit. I talk about mystery in general. There are any mystery story, there are definitely certain parts of it that definitely reflect maybe not the entire gospel, but the truth, or that we are sinners, that we need to repent, that we need some sort of salvation. Could we call Sherlock Holmes a Christ figure? Probably not. I would have to push that farther. Batman is much more a Christ figure than Sherlock Holmes. And that is not a sentence I was expecting to say.
Both are pretty flawed characters.
But Batman sacrifices himself in a way that Sherlock Holmes does not, for the love of other people. But both expose evil. Both of them try to work to make the world a better place. Neither of them, Sherlock Holmes does it for his own interest. He is in it because this is fun. Batman, sorry, loves the city of Gotham. I'm just laughing because, like, you've got we could do some interesting stuff with Batman as a Christ figure. It's not going to be a complete allegory with a one-to-one representation, but more of a typology where there's definitely connections and things that can make you think about him. There's also places where we can see that both Sherlock Holmes and Batman would fall down as Christ figures.
I made a comment that maybe Sherlock is like the Holy Spirit.
Did the person who made that comment flesh that out anymore, or just sort of throw that out there?
No, I'm curious about that too. I'd love to hear more.
Yeah. I'm
not mentioning names since this is being recorded. I forgot to mention that I would not mention names since we are going to post this on YouTube. But if the person who mentioned that would, because Sherlock is illuminating and investigating. Thank you for clarifying.
That is really interesting.
Shining light on deception.
Definitely
fascinating. Goes back to that idea of the themes and the good news coming out in many different ways. And
definitely.
That's fascinating. Well, I think that's it for questions in the chat. I have one more question for you.
Okay.
If we don't have any more, you really expanded my mind with talking about where the wild things are. So are there any other children's stories that people tend not to think about having fascinating bits like that are very related to the gospel, or that do a lot behind the scenes? And if nothing comes to mind, I know I'm putting you on the spot, so that's okay.
Oh my goodness.
I guess if somebody came up to you on the street and said, tell me a children's book that doesn't seem to have anything to do with Christ on the surface, would you have a go-to?
Okay. I'm afraid my go-to might be Where the Wild Things Are, but let me think for a minute. If you're talking about for older children, obviously, and Kay, I think you and I have talked about this before, the Harry Potter books, definitely. For older children, it's easy because I can think of lots of them. Lloyd Alexander's Pride and Chronicles that I already named. Even Ursula Le Guin, she's interesting. She did the Earthsea trilogy in the 60s and 70s, late 60s, early 70s. Then a lot of people pointed out that there are a lot of Christ-like imagery and a lot of Christian imagery in those. So she came back a few decades later and wrote 3 more stories to kind of deliberately counteract that, because she was not comfortable with what other people saw in her stories that she had not thought about, which is fascinating in and of itself.
Yeah.
Ooh, what else?
I think you've given several great examples.
Okay, good. I'm like looking at my bookcase over there going,
I think I think that is it. And we are set to end almost right on time, just a couple minutes early. So thank you again, Dr. Green. This has been wonderful. Thank you everyone who participated in the chat. I guess a couple of more just reminder again that summer registration is open for anyone interested in auditing or taking seminary classes for credit. Unfortunately, this is our last taste of seminary for this spring, but I imagine we'll be back in the fall, either in person or in Zoom, probably to be determined. So hope everybody's end of the semester is going well, and thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Kay, for hosting it tonight.
My pleasure. Take care. God bless. Bye, all. Oh, and yes, the others are going to be posted on YouTube. It may, with the end of the semester and everything happening at once, it may be a couple weeks, just to be quite honest. But I guess my guess is that there will be an email going out announcing it when we have all 4 of them on YouTube too. Thanks for asking that great question. Okay, thank you. Good night.
Good night.